Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Bridget Custon. Greetings from Oxford. I'm an anthropologist here at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford, and it is my distinct honor to be the host of this incredible session that we have lined up for you, which is part 3 of our series, Intersectionality and Inclusion. Now, as an anthropologist, I examine the complexity of humans and how human complexity then inevitably goes on to shape the institutions, communities, businesses that humans go on to build. And intersectionality is a rich topic for us to explore here at a business school because it does not simply mean that we all have multiple facets to our identities. We all do have intersecting elements to who we are, but intersectionality actually has a very specific genealogy, and that's part of what we're going to parse today. So when the lawyer and the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coined the word intersectionality, it wasn't on Instagram, it wasn't on Twitter, it wasn't a hot take. It was actually to respond to the fact that when some individuals have multiple facets to their identity, so in Dr. Crenshaw's case, she was discussing Black women in the context of domestic violence and the law, some of those overlapping identities mean that people cannot be fully seen or fully received by the world around them. Now, we're bringing you this series from the Open Executive Education program at the Said Business School because any challenge in society is also a challenge for business and for business leaders. And when it comes to intersectionality and this question of who can be fully seen, who can be fully received by the world around them, this is a question for authentic leadership. How can authentic leadership be possible when certain aspects of ourselves might not be fully expressed or even seen? Now, this concept of visibility was the subject of part 1 in this series, where we examined where we examined the skin condition of albinism, and pathways to visibility, which was a session led by Dr. Zainab Kaba, spoke with those at Sesame Workshop, the creators of the children's show Sesame Street, who were on the path toward creating a character with albinism to build awareness from the grassroots up. So the question there was, how do we build a movement really from the ground up by educating children? The second episode of this series, and all of this, by the way, is available on the YouTube channel for the Said Business School or on the webpage for this series, Intersectionality and Inclusion. The second episode examined women entrepreneurs and how they built inclusivity and managed to tackle world-scale challenges through allies, through supportive communities, and what that took. And now in this episode, we return to the topic of the skin condition of albinism, looking at strength beyond all odds, female leaders who defy the odds. We're continuing our discussion about what it takes to build durable inclusivity and durable visibility from the ground up, especially for populations who might not have been able to fully express all facets of themselves or be fully received for all of their human richness and complexity. So with that, let me give the panelists a chance to introduce themselves. We will start with Carol.
Hello, my name is Carol Prendergast. I'm an attorney, and I have been a human rights advocate for over 40 years. I've worked on various human rights and humanitarian issues, primarily working with victims of torture, refugees, other victims of forced migration, and working primarily within the context of international NGOs. In the last couple of years, I have begun working as an advisor to the New York Dermatology Group Foundation on their project on albinism, the Colorful Campaign, and helping to develop their partnership with the UN High Commission for Human Rights and with Sesame Street. And I'm very happy to be here and to be included in this very nice group of people.
And Carol, you're joining us from?
I'm joining from New York.
From New York, that's right, thank you. Next, let's hear from IK.
Thanks, Bridget. Hello, everyone. My name is IK. Full name is Ikmaosa, and I am originally from Nigeria, immigrated to Canada as a child with my family, still in Canada. Happy Canada Day to anyone who's Canadian. This is our July 1st celebration. I currently serve at the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as their independent expert on albinism. And I am currently joining you from Vancouver. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, IK. And last but not least, Shuli.
Hello, I'm Shuli Ebbing. I'm a model, but I'm also a supporter. I have done a lot of interviews on the subject of albinism, for example, with the BBC, with the article Shuli Ebbing, the model, the abandoned child who became a Vogue model. And thank you for thank you very much that I'm part of this exciting group with special people.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you. And this panel to me is an exciting one because it is what so many panels are not. First of all, it's all female. It is multinational and it is intergenerational. And we have, I suppose, 3 to 4 generations represented on this panel. And when it comes to building durable change, it's a generational process. And so I invite all of you to reflect on your vantage points onto the topic as individuals who have such varied life experiences. So with that, let's get into our first question, which is an intersectional approach to inclusivity allows people to choose how they identify. And we've already heard a bit about this in your introductions to yourselves, but let's go into this a bit deeper. IK, Carol, Shuli, how do you choose to identify and why?
Sure. So for me, I identify first and foremost as an African Black woman. And whenever I say that publicly, people chuckle, especially when they don't understand that I have albinism. So I say, hey, I'm a Black woman, don't mess with me. And they laugh, but I am. And when I check off my census forms, I check off Black. And then in the space for other, I write albinism because I think they can coexist and together they define who I am and how people relate to me. I also identify as a person with a disability because albinism not only gives you a different appearance, it also impacts your vision. So most of us have low vision. Finally, I identify as someone, a racialized group. So a person or a part of a group facing racial discrimination, because that's a discrimination also based on color, which is not necessarily something that has to always be linked to race to be found. So in a nutshell, that's how I define myself. Thanks.
And that answer in and of itself to me reveals the impoverished nature of corporate responses to diversity, equity, and inclusion that focus on a singular characteristic as being what they might try to support when your own self-narrative shows the centrality of these overlapping forms of identification. Carol, Shuli, how do you choose to identify and why?
Well, I think like IK and all of us, I feel that I have multiple identities. Interestingly enough, and this might well be a generational issue, I did not strongly identify as a person with albinism until I really became involved in working on this issue. I was aware that people with albinism suffered some terrible human rights abuses throughout the world, but I saw that through the lens of being a human rights attorney, a human rights advocate. I think that I identified more as a person with disabilities because I am legally blind, and that was the main challenge for me growing up to overcome that. And of course, I identify as a woman. But I think that fundamentally, I've become more in touch with my identity as a person with albinism. And it is interesting to see how it can emerge at different points in your life, because I literally obviously knew I had albinism, but it was not really integrated into my own view of myself until the last couple of years, and I was doing this work. And I would just say that my lead identity, which they never ask you on any form, is that I identify as a humanist, because I just deeply believe that everyone should be seen for who they are and respected and given the dignity that they deserve, not only by governments and institutions, but by all of us between ourselves. So if I were to pick one thing, I would say that I am most prominently a humanist.
Mm, mm, mm. Thank you for that. Again, another answer that just completely defies and flies in the face of corporate logics that might assume that identity is fixed, right? And that people's primary identification is a thing. And once they've named it, they've done their work. Shuli, what about you?
There are different parts in my life that define me. I'm, for example, a female. I was born in China, and I have albinism. But also, I define myself as a human, but I really do not know what defines me because I'm very young and I'm still experiencing things that give me different opinions about different parts in my own life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well,
And
that
I'm
sounds like...
also adopted.
Sorry, say that one more time. I'm afraid I might have accidentally spoken over you.
I'm also adopted, so that brings other issues with being adopted, brings other issues with this thing. But first and foremost, I'm a human being, and I'm here to explain what's albinism and how people can help me or other people with albinism.
Well, we were saying before this webcast started, Shuli, that you might be the youngest presenter in the history of the business school in one of our events. So for someone who is so young, you certainly have a tremendous amount of self-awareness, and we can all learn from you. IK, given the complexity of identity that has been just sketched out right now, and from your vantage point as a seasoned campaigner for albinism awareness, how do we move beyond tokenism to genuine inclusion? And how can companies even know the difference?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because I think I see a lot of criticism about tokenism online, and tokenism being defined as some kind of perfunctory or symbolic gesture that has no depth. I take a slightly different view. I think tokenism is the beginning of real change on this issue, because sometimes the awkwardness of what to do is not always clear to businesses or to organizations. And so you have to kind of be forgiven. One of the biggest things I've learned in the last 6 years on the mandate, and I come to a close in 30 days, is forgiveness is a big part of the expectations for change. So the company has to be forgiven to themselves, but other people have to be forgiven to the company and allow them to persist. So two things to get over tokenism is to do more of it. Yeah. So first of all, invade your organization with the people you want to see, you want to include. So replicate the tokenism, and over time, it will take root as something beyond tokenism. And how do you facilitate that? Then this is the second thing to do, is to encourage storytelling, listening, and also making sure that these people have a platform, of course, in a way that is integrated with the vision of the business, so that everything is one integral whole and not like, one thing taking over the other. So this takes some kind of somebody orchestrating, like a choir, a conductor of a choir, so to speak. So I think business is a science, but in this sense, it's also an art. And using tokenism first as the form, and then over time, it will become substantive if you do more of it and you let it grow. Yeah.
Spoken like the person you are, which is someone who has been in the trenches on this issue for long enough to understand what it takes to enact change. Carol, IK, we're a business school. Current and future business leaders are tuning into this event. What's the message for these business leaders? What work does business have to do beyond what you just said about tokenism and how that is the beginning of change? What is the role of business when you consider albinism rights? Moving beyond that, Carol, in your case, your work on human rights more generally, what's the role of business in all this?
Well, I think that business, just like the public sector, the NGO sector, business plays a very important role. And I think that when we think about business, we tend to think about multinational brands and huge corporations. And I think IK began to speak to that and can probably say much more than that than I can. But I'd like to also point to the fact that business encompasses a lot of different things. For example, you have financial organizations. So microfinancing is now a very established thing, which helps to include marginalized populations. I would say to current and future business people, if you're in the microcredit financing industry or any part of the finance industry, you need to be proactive about finding who are the groups and the people who are not in your portfolio, who are not the people who maybe know what you do or what you can do to support their efforts and their efforts to be sustaining and self-supporting. I would say the same thing to social impact investors, another emerging, or well, it has emerged now, it was emerging a number of years ago, and it's really taken root now. Well, there are social impact funds addressing issues like climate and so on, but there are very, very few that address, for example, people with disabilities. I would urge more people to consider forming those funds, which can help to finance the individual issue, the individual work of people with disabilities. And I would also urge investors to look to see, to really demand of companies to enlarge their portfolios, to express, really, to be proactive consumers and investors and say, we want to be a part of creating social change. And I think that has begun, but I think we have a lot further to go. And we should never underestimate the ability of anybody, even if they are discriminated against, poor, disabled, marginalized in any way. We should never underestimate the power of people to, given the opportunity and given the resources, to create a life of dignity for themselves. And that's what I think most people want.
And Carol, I assume you bring this view to the entrepreneurial fund that you sit on the board of, Alfana Capital. And is this view received well? What kind of pushback do you get, and how do you respond to it?
Well, Alfana is actually the first venture philanthropy group in the Middle East. So what we do is we invest in social entrepreneurs for 5 years, and we give them seed money. The next step, and we also provide technical assistance and so on. And it's just inspiring what people can do given the opportunity and given the resources. So I have learned a lot through that experience. After an organization or a person has shown themselves to be sustainable after 5 years, we at Alfana exit, but then often there is a space for a social impact investor or an investor fund to come in to provide low interest loans to them. So I want to add one other thing, since you've given me this opportunity to talk about philanthropy. Corporations also need to think seriously about their corporate philanthropy. And health and education are two very broad areas that many corporations support. And I think that albinism can't be viewed as a niche issue, as a disability or a condition that impacts on a small number of people. It really needs to be embodied in broader issues of health and education. And for example, pharmaceutical companies who make sunscreen should be particularly concerned about supporting groups working on albinism issues, people who do technological work for vision impaired people. These are kind of natural connections with their message. And groups and organizations, corporations that are interested in education obviously should be looking at Sesame's albinism initiative and be open to supporting that. So I think corporate philanthropy also has a very big role to play.
Excellent, thank you. IK, what would be your message for business leaders who are tuning in? What work does business have to do? What's the role of business in all this?
Well, I don't think I have to say, but maybe it's worth noting that businesses are shifting from the very strict sense of who they once were in the last few decades to more of an area that nurtures a transformational approach where the audience, or let's say the public, is looking for businesses that have not only a mind, but a heart. And so the personhood that we call business in the legal sense, they are looking for more of a dynamic version of that, as opposed to a mere skeletal, cold legal entity. So I think it's in this context that I support everything Carol's just said. And just to underscore and to add a little bit that businesses have to therefore, in this their transformational approach, do not wait for people with disabilities, people with albinism, minority, racialized groups to approach them, but to budget for that, to budget for accommodation for people with disabilities, and then ask their human resources to proactively seek out these people. For instance, here in Canada, there's the Blind Institute that has a program where they're looking for corporations who are able to hire people with low vision. I was a beneficiary of this program decades ago, and I worked with the Royal Bank of Canada as a result, only because the Royal Bank of Canada told the Blind Institute that we are willing to hire X type of person. And so this kind of engagement between the corporation and the people group is important for mutual listening, but also to craft a position within your organization that you truly need, not a position that you're using to be a mere token, but a position that someone could really deliver their skills to you. I also finally wanted to say that businesses can change the attitudes, of people at their workplace. There's a lot of initiatives to decolonize, deracialize, but there should be also clean the minds of your staff when it comes to disabilities, and have training on that, and then be courageous. After all, the first model with albinism that is very well known, who you might have seen, Deandra Forrest in the United States, somebody took a risk to hire her when everyone else thought the rest of us were odd and nothing to show on the walkways. Someone said, this is someone I want to try. I'm going to reach out. I'm going to be courageous. So it takes courage. It takes proactiveness. It takes some budgeting, and it takes mutual listening, and you'll begin to transform society for many people.
Well, you have just done what so many business leaders ask for, which is, what do you want us to do? What is the thing that we can do? And I think you've just laid down the gauntlet, which is create real jobs, not jobs to tick a box, and reach out before your marketing team comes to you and says, oh, this is what we need to do to look a certain way. Reach out first. I think that's an excellent challenge. And we're going to be watching. The world is going to be watching to see who takes it up. Shuli, as a young person, still navigating what it means to now have the public platform that you have. And for those of you who don't know, if you Google Shuli, you will see her Vogue magazine editorial. And it's absolutely stunning, but it now has given you this public platform. Now that you're navigating this, what would you say is the most important priority when it comes to albinism from your point of view? It's one thing for a business school to say, this is the topic that matters, this is what we need to do, but this is your lived experience. And so your voice matters most of all. What is the priority from your point of view?
I think that the important thing to do is to learn people that albinism is a genetic condition and it's not some curse. So keep educating people about about the subject.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And look for the same rights, that people with albinism have the same rights, and that people with albinism are not judged by color or by that they have a handicap, but by who they are and what they can do, what their abilities are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this was exactly what Deandra Forrest, so the world's first model with albinism, who IK just referenced, she said the same thing, which was you have to do your research, right? There is no shortcut. It takes time. It takes the humility of being willing to learn. For those of you who don't know, we recorded a short interview with Deandra Forrest before this webcast. You can find it on the YouTube page for Oxford Said Business School, where Deandra reflects on issues relating to identity and her journey as an advocate for albinism awareness. And also, before we get to the last question, please type your own questions into the box. We're going to get to audience Q&A in just a moment. So send through your questions for Carol, for IK, for Shuli. Now, IK and Carol, you are both highly experienced in working in politicized environments, navigating different policies, different governments, different religious beliefs. Why discuss albinism rights in a global context when challenges in different nations can be so specific?
Thanks for the question. I believe that even though we have such a wide spectrum of discrimination faced by persons with albinism worldwide, we do share some similarities, one of the biggest being attitudinal barriers. Attitudes towards people with albinism has been very disturbing in almost every country in the world. Of course, on the extreme end are the countries where people with albinism are viewed as material for witch doctors, and then so-called witch doctors, and then they are attacked, killed, mutilated, with hundreds of cases reported to date. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the attitudinal barriers that are more about dehumanizing people with albinism. You see how we're portrayed in films, Da Vinci Code, Princess Bride, or even in books. And most people know more about us from literature than anything else, which often translates into very difficult bullying for people, students with albinism, parents withdrawing their children as a result to do homeschooling in many cases. So I believe the attitudinal barriers run through, even though the severity varies. Human rights gives us this platform to be able to counter attitudinal barriers while also adhering to universal principles, standards that every country is bound by in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Also allows us to hold government accountable to do their job to protect people with albinism. And also human rights is empowering language. It's language that doesn't only subject us to the medical approach where you see doctors putting photos of us in books and talking about the patient is X or the patient is Y, and you see the silent patient in the textbook with their faces blurred and all that. Human rights gives us dignified languages to talk about ourselves, such as through intersectionality, and it gives other people language to refer to us so that there's a mutual respect, mutual dignity. So the global approach was the human rights approach for us, from my point of view. And also for solidarity, the global approach really gave us this avenue to live by that proverb that, you know, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with people. So going global was our way of achieving that.
And in fact, in the planning for this call, it was wonderful to realize that many of you already knew each other on this panel, knew Deandra. The community is active. It seems incredibly supportive. Carol, let's hear from you. Why discuss albinism rights in a global context despite the deep national, regional specificity of issues that can be faced?
Well, I would just like to agree with absolutely everything that IK has just said, as I almost always do. But I would also add that it is very different in different places and different cultures. I think for me, for example, one of the reasons why I did not identify more strongly as a person with albinism is because I was fortunate enough to be growing up in New York City, to have access to private education, to not feel discriminated against for having albinism. I may or may not, I'll never know, have been discriminated against because of being legally blind. But it was nothing like the experience that other people have had throughout the world. But I think that in addition to what we all have in common in terms of our right to be treated with dignity and in adherence to the Convention for Human Rights, I would also say that the local groups, there are, to our knowledge, there are over 200 local groups of people with albinism or whose families have a family member with albinism who are active throughout the world. And IK, during her mandate, has done a lot in helping to identify these groups. Now, they know what they need. They know what they need, but having a global approach, having a UN mandate, having the Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights addressing albinism as a human rights issue gives them a much more elevated platform, gives them a space, gives them language, and also provides an opportunity for sharing experiences across countries. There have been alliances built across Africa. There's a global alliance that is in the early stages of building, where all these local groups can come together, can work to support one another and learn from one another. And I think if we had not approached this as a global human rights issue, people would all be working by themselves, trying to figure it out, but not feeling that communal support. And they'll figure out what needs to be done in their state, in their country, in their situation. They know how to implement that. But we're helping to provide support by promoting this as a global issue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It strikes me as incredibly meaningful to, make the point that, as you have, that multiple scales of action are necessary. The local is necessary. The global is necessary. This isn't an either or proposition. And, that mindset of scarcity, I think, can easily take hold when one is talking about a minority group, right? That the strategy must settle on one thing and focus on that. But what you're arguing for really is plentitude and multiple courses of action. Any thoughts there before we turn to the audience questions?
Yes. Yes, I do. Actually, I think we also need to look on a school level with including people with albinism, because I'm not going to school. That's really hard for me to say, because I always say, when people ask me about, do I go to school? Yes, I do, and I have good grades. I did have good grades my first year at high school, but it started to begin. It was harder. Teachers will not include me with gym classes, for example. When you are choosing to go on a team, you are picked last because you have, this condition that everyone can see. And people are judging by my color and judging by the things I can't do, but I can do things. And I do not talk about those things often, because I don't like to say, hi, I'm a model, I'm a sporter, but sometimes I just want to say, hey, I am a model, and I trained on national level with multiple sports.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And indeed, when we first were preparing for this panel, you identified, I think, after being a model and 16-year-old, you said, I'm a rock climber. This is who I am. This is part of my identity.
Yeah.
And yet it sounds like the structures around you are not able to see that and support it and provide a structural way for you to, to do what you would like to do and need to do.
If I could just add something, Bridget, is to Shuli, it is so heartbreaking to hear what you're saying, Shuli. And I know so many young people have that experience. And that's why I say I was so fortunate not to have had that experience, but it is a common experience. It's a common experience. And I am so glad that you, through, I'm sure, a lot of hard inner work, that you are holding on to your sense of who you are. Because for many people faced with that kind of exclusion from peers and from teachers who are people that we look to help lead us and model good behavior for the students, many people who would not have the strength that you have within you would simply fold in on themselves and internalize how other people are treating them. And I think that happens to a lot of people. And and I think in schools, you're absolutely right. That is the first place that we need to be addressing this, because the attitudes that people have when they're young, I think part of my experience was I had a very happy school experience. So I never thought, and even with my eyesight, people would help me, the teacher would help me. There were not even large print books when I was going to school, and yet the extra effort was made. But that was only made because I was fortunate enough to be able to go to a private school with small classes. So again, this is what should be available to everybody, not just somebody who has the resources. We should all be given those resources. And I just want to congratulate you on your stamina and your strength of spirit.
Thank you very much. But I do have to say, I had big books and I had software, but I just didn't feel at home. There were teachers that were kind to me, but also who didn't understand it. And I was a teen, so I was insecure. And now I am on this panel, so I feel now a lot stronger than I did at my first year of high school. So I think it's also very important, even if you have the resources. I'm a very gifted person because I am in the Netherlands. I have those resources, but still I can't find my own way. I need to search for my own way.
Well, there's nothing stronger than being vulnerable in front of an audience of hundreds. So I stand in absolute admiration for who you are, and have the absolute certainty that who you will become will be someone even more inspiring as you continue on this journey. So thank you for sharing with us.
You're welcome.
Heike, I want to bring in an audience question that connects, I believe, between your experiences and what Shuli has just shared with us. Now, the question is, how might companies collaborate and network to collectively unlock opportunities to create more inclusivity? And are there places for companies to connect or belong to that can provide resources? And for me, the end game of that question is, Shuli has sketched out a need, which is educational interventions and better support for students, right? And if that's the end game of a need that has to be addressed on one end, and then you have companies with resources and inclusivity mandates on the other end, what does it take to bring these two together?
I think from experience and going back to what was mentioned, I think that companies have to be more proactive now. This is part of the new form of leadership. It is true that they do not, on the surface, have the same legal obligation as a government. But like I said, this move to the transformational form of doing business is doing business that is profitable, but also human and humane. And also responsibilities can be shifted from the state to companies. And I'm sure many of you in the business school know that. But I know on cases like this, which, you know, you are not necessarily violating someone's human rights. This is not about going to extract oil from Nigeria's oil region. at the expense of the villagers. This is more about how can I help this young girl in high school? How can I help that child who is now, I don't know, has mental health issues because of what they went through in their African American community in the United States? And how can I help the other one who just got attacked in Malawi? These are questions that the business doesn't have an obligation to respond to, but is beginning to have a social obligation out of expectation that is coming from our society as it changes. So I would say that a company who is interested has to be proactive, because most of these organizations supporting people with albinism, people with disabilities, do not necessarily know that your company has the capacity. They won't know that because it doesn't show in your financial records or in your public face. So you have to have your human resource, have somebody in charge of inclusion, building a transformational company to find some of the best talents with albinism out there, with disabilities out there, and get them to go out and meet the Blind Institute, the Deaf Institute, Institute of People with Physical Challenges, and work with them to create this position in your company where they can truly serve without faking it. Don't fake a position, just create it. So I would say mutual listening, reaching out, because only you know what you can do, and they'll be very happy to hear you out. You can even pay for programs like maybe a high school friendship program, and it can be called, whatever company after school program and such. So I think there's a lot of opportunity if you take the lead.
Now, there's another audience question that I would direct to Carol that builds on what you've just shared, Ike. The question is, if a senior leader is responsible for building an inclusive climate, sometimes this is overwhelming. Where should they start? Now, we've heard you say, Ike, that it requires leadership. It requires being proactive. Carol, what would you add to this in terms of starting points for someone that knows they have to do this work? We can assume they're good intentions and they're not sure where to begin.
Well, where to begin? There are so many levels of inclusiveness, and there is plenty to choose from in terms of bringing a variety of people into a corporate setting. And I think that one of the main things is, in being proactive, to not feel that I'm coming to you because, say to an Institute for the Blind or a disabilities group, I'm not coming to you, as IK says, to like check the box. I'm coming to you to let the people who are involved with your organization or who your organization serves, to let them know what opportunities we have. And when they're brought into the organization or even interviewed, I think it's very important to be sure that, using the word integrated, but to be sure that when they are brought in, that they are given the space to succeed, that they're given the space to have dialogue with other people in the company. Just as we're seeing with Shu Li, it's hard to come into a setting, say an educational setting would be the same thing in coming into a corporation, and to be vulnerable in that setting. So I think that there are two parts to it. One is to do the outreach, which is, there's plenty to choose from. I think you just need to do that legwork, to reach out, to communicate. And the second, which I think is more challenging, is once you're drawing people in, to provide them with a real experience and to provide them with a welcoming environment. And a welcoming environment is not just sensitivity training or diversity training. It is the way you as a corporate leader treat somebody that you're bringing in who is not the same as everybody else who's there, the way you treat them and the way you honor their uniqueness. And again, just like teachers, I think it's modeling that, and you can't fake it. You have to feel it. So I'm not sure that really answers the question, but I think it just takes a lot of inner work, frankly, on the part of HR people and other corporate leaders who are looking to diversify and include people. They have to do the inner work themselves and think about how are they looking at these people who are, quote unquote, different than them or different than their company. And if they're not truly open to seeing them as just another person who has talents and skills to offer, then it's not going to work. They have to have that in their own hearts, I think. So that's where I would begin.
Now, we have another question that builds on what you've just said, which is, rather than quotas, what should companies consider as the measure of success? You've already started talking about this, Carol, by saying the environment matters, intention matters. What else can be considered a measure of success beyond box ticking, beyond quotas?
Well, I think that any corporation or small business, small or large, has a mission, and that it's very important for the mission, whatever it is, to be thought of in terms of the people being served and the larger community. So, for example, when I was talking earlier about, say, pharmaceutical companies, well, we know that's, despite the discussions we could all have about pharmaceutical companies and how much money they make and so on and so forth, basically the mission is to provide cures, provide treatment, provide prevention for illness. And I think that it can't just be that. That is the mission. But I think their larger mission has to be to have an impact on the larger community. Who gets hired, who gets included, and who has input into that. So it's, I guess, just seeing social impact has become another box that we tick. But again, I would say to think of the impact of your hiring, your staffing, your idea development, your R&D, to really believe that the more people you have there, the more and larger community you're serving and the more diverse community you're serving. Not to just focus, as I was saying earlier about albinism, I don't like to think of albinism being a niche. I like to think of, when we're advocating for people with albinism, we're advocating for everybody who has a difference that has a negative impact on their life experience. So we may be doing it through the lens of albinism, but we have to see it more broadly. And I think in looking at their impact, I think corporations have to look in a broader way in terms of how they're affecting the larger world.
Well said. And this is why, until Black Lives Matter, I cannot flourish. This is why my feminism is intersectional. It's because human flourishing is indeed connected, and we cannot flourish until we are all flourishing. IK, Shuli, what would you say is the measure of success beyond quotas for inclusion?
For my part, I would say we need indicators. And right now, there are clear indicators on how to measure success in the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So people with albinism fall into the larger group, as Carol was mentioning, the larger group of people with disabilities. But for some of us, we also fall under the larger groups of racialized groups, like the Convention on Eliminating Racial Discrimination. But since the majority fall under the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, I'll use that as my takeoff point to suggest starting with the indicators that have been developed for the CRPD. And then companies, say, for instance, in the UK, like a few companies who are partners or work together in some form or in the same industry, could then form like a Friends for People with Disabilities coalition, for instance, so a partnership like that. So like, let's say Huggies making diapers can approach, another company making diapers, and they could come together and have this loose friendship and put aside their competitiveness for the moment. Or maybe if that's naive, partner with anybody you want, and then come up with this coalition of firms, and then come up with the indicators that are adapted to where you are. So take, for instance, the CRPD indicators on employment rights, and then adapt them to where you are. But you must have in the room people with disabilities joining you as partners and not just as subsidiary entities, to come up with what those indicators are. And look, there you are, you've created indicators for employment disabilities or inclusion in employment for the UK. Maybe there is one, I don't know. I'm just saying this is something that can be done if it doesn't exist. And then you can then measure yourselves with those indicators to see how you're moving forward, because that indicator is something that has been developed not only by yourselves as business-minded, profit-driven entities, but also by people with disabilities. And the indicator will be like a emerging or integration of both of those goals in a way that satisfies both parties at the end of it. So this is something I think that can be done to measure the impact of inclusion, and that is objective, but also inclusive in the measurements itself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Shuli, what do you think success should look like beyond?
If you are starting to look for success, you won't find it because you are looking to that specific thing. But if you look to people who are up to the job and examples of people who can beat the odds, then I think you can reach that goal. But if you are looking to one thing, you will go in circles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, another question for you, Shuli, from an audience member. Having entered the modeling world and experienced the challenges of the modeling world, are there other avenues you plan to explore to support the vital work that you're doing?
I think it's important that we should talk about this subject, and not me as a model, but me as a person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in your own personal life, you will continue your advocacy regardless of modeling?
Yes, I think I am that person now that can talk about it, but I'm also that person who can talk about my disability as a climber or as an athlete.
Mm-hmm. Now, to take the conversation in a slightly different direction, but I think this is some empirically useful information for our audience. IK, there's a question for you. You referenced that your tenure with the UN, your mandate is coming to a close. There's a question, is the UN continuing the mandate on albinism? What is the future of the UN-based advocacy work?
Thankfully, the UN has decided to continue the mandate. I was the first mandate holder appointed in 2015, and this year they've decided to renew for another 3 years. And I believe by the end of July, there will be a new appointment. The UN seems to be committed to the issue, especially because the attacks are still going on in some countries, and then some other countries are yet to be explored, especially in Asia, to find out what happens there, because we know there are some violations, maybe not attacks, but some serious violations. So I'm glad that they will be continuing. And finally, they have a campaign site that is still up, albinism.ochr.org, where they have a lot of stories of people with albinism. Yes, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Now, we have a few moments left. Let's hear from all of our panelists their answer to a question we've received, which is, who has an example of an organization or a leader that has done proactive inclusion particularly well? What does good look like, and how can others aspire to it? So who out there is doing the right thing, setting an example that should be followed? It is time for us to name names.
I think Joseph Turner is a good example of someone who is a great example, but I think that everyone in his own or her own way, or that he or she is doing is making his own legacy. And Joseph Turner sadly passed away, but I still see his legacy, and I see still how he's doing, how he's changing the world, even if he did pass away.
Mm, mm, mm.
And an example about a company, I think also that we are changing. That, for example, companies, for example, Chocolonely, is saying about people who were not treated right, that they are saying, well, we're gonna help this world in making sure that people who are lower on the social standards, that we are gonna or that Tony Chocolonely is gonna treat those people equal, and that they get good pay rates.
And this is, for those of you who don't know, this is a Dutch chocolate company.
Okay.
What other examples of individual leaders, organizations might we start to think of as models in this space? Although, as Shuli just said, which is a very powerful point, that everyone needs to also think about making their own legacy rather than just copying what others have done. Oh,
I find it hard to answer this. Sorry.
Go ahead, Carol.
Oh, I was going to say, I find it distressing that I'm having so much trouble answering this question, which maybe is an answer in and of itself. But I think that I hesitate to do it because I feel that we are very much at the beginning of this road. And I think that that Shuli makes a very good point that we should not be looking to a person or a company to see how is it done, or that's what it looks like, because it will look different in different contexts. And I would rather turn it around to say, for everyone to think, what could they be doing to become an organization that we would all be jumping in there to name? There certainly are a lot of organizations that are active in corporate philanthropy, are trying to make diversity efforts. But to really be inclusive, I think we're really at the very, very beginning of this road. And that would be a very interesting forum, and it may need to be a private forum, I'm not even thinking a public forum, is for companies that are dedicated to this, are truly dedicated, to meet and to share ideas and to share things that have failed, not just we're such a success-driven society that we're often not willing to say, we tried X, Y, and Z, and it doesn't really feel like we really made any progress, and for people to learn from what they tried and what didn't work. So I'm sure that I'm not giving credit to some people who deserve credit, but I do think that we should be struck by the fact that we're not, listing dozens of high achievers in this area, which isn't to be discouraging. It's to say, I think it's a process, and I would like more businesses to be on that road. And I encourage every business that is already on that road, which frankly are probably, I mean, this is sort of different than what the question is, but I think that microfinancing groups come to mind to me, not as trying to create diversity or inclusion, but through microcredit, they are enabling more diverse and more disenfranchised groups of people to have independence and dignity through microcredit. But it's a different kind of thing, but that's how I would picture something that's been very successful.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're almost out of time, but IK, closing thoughts on this question.
Sure. So it is true that this is the beginning of a journey, but those who have started well or in the past or even now include, for instance, in Canada, I would give credit to the Royal Bank of Canada. Indeed, they're a very big and successful bank. And I think these corporations that are very successful, thanks to them, they have more risk to take on this issue to be more transformational. So RBC gave me my first opportunity. I became a bank, what you call a banker, or bank teller, we say in North America. And I never imagined I would. They gave me a big screen and all that, and I worked fine with them. However, one thing I should say is that I was able to go through their interview processes with enough confidence. A lot of my colleagues with low vision disabilities didn't have it so easy. So one area I see corporations really helping to facilitate inclusivity is to help build some particular empowerment training programs that help people with disabilities know how to be less, for instance, socially awkward. Let's face it, a lot of people who have been socially marginalized carry a certain degree of awkwardness. And the reason why mine might be little is because I'm Nigerian and many of us are not shy. Yeah. So because of the population or whatever. But I think a lot of my colleagues, I watch them act and I find that, okay, if I was an entrepreneur, maybe I wouldn't have been ready to hire this type of social behavior. So I think the people with disabilities need to be supported because marginalization breeds more marginalization. It makes them awkward. They get more marginalized. So this is where corporations can invest. The second example is from the Global South. Safaricom, I think it was, who, whenever they had a contest on albinism, they had Mr. and Mrs. Albinism as a kind of fun way to raise awareness. They would show up and hire like 10 people at once. So competitions, offering competitions, maybe not pageantries, since those are now not popular in this part of the world, but you can offer competitions and then pay and then give as prizes, job placements, and then give them training through that. So those were the two examples that I think are on their way to becoming more solid examples.
This brings us to the end of this session. Thank you so much, IK, Shuli, Carol, for your reflections, your candidness. We've all benefited for it. And I would encourage everyone to share the link to this webcast far and wide. The video will be shared with those who've registered. I believe it will also be available on the YouTube page for the Saïd Business School. Stay in touch with the work that IK is doing on Twitter. Shuli, we will continue to look for you in the pages of Vogue. And Carol, your observations are a gift to us all. So thank you, everyone. And we hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you.